Today on Against the Grain, what are public banks and what role can they play in addressing the social and ecological crises we face? I'm CS. Thomas Marois discusses the transformative potential of public banking institutions. And this is Against the Grain on Pacifica Radio. My name is CS Song. Money. Not just effort and time, but money, massive amounts of it, are needed to confront the multiple crises besetting societies around the world. But it matters not just how much money can be made available, but where that money comes from, which institutions lend or bestow it. According to Thomas Marois, public banks must play a critical role in propelling us toward a more socially and ecologically just world. But he asserts that public banks, a great number of them, must be reclaimed and democratized. Many such institutions need to be compelled to operate in the public interest so as to serve society and protect the planet. Marois' writings also seek to locate public banks within a history of socialist thinking on the transformation of banking and finance. Thomas Marois is professor of political economy and Canada Research Chair in Public Banking at McMaster University in Canada. His books include Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization. He co-authored with Susan Spronk an essay titled The Democratic and Transformative Potential of Public Banks, which is part of the volume Socialist Register 2025, Openings and Closures, Socialist Strategy at a Crossroads. When Thomas and I connected recently, I asked what sorts of projects and initiatives require the mobilization of capital on a grand scale.
On really the top of most people's mind right now is the climate crisis in terms of, thinking about resilient infrastructure, water systems, biodiversity. So the whole kind of range of activities that would fall broadly under the sustainable development goals or climate action. There's many different ways to refer to it. So all of those are going to need, quite a lot of new investments, long-term, but also affordable investments. But at the same time, we're also struggling with, questions of unequal development and inequality, both within countries and global north and south. So not only do we need climate finance, but we need climate-aligned development finance for good jobs, for sort of prosperous communities, if you will, and then related and other significant challenges around affordable housing, decent living, and those sorts of communities that we want to build. Just because, as you and many of your listeners would know, 40 years of neoliberalism and sort of letting the market try to decide all this has really starved everyone but the wealthiest of this world from the communities, the homes, the infrastructure, and the jobs that they need for a decent living.
You believe there needs to be much more public bank funding and financing of critically important infrastructure and other projects. So let's start with some basics. What is a public bank?
A public bank, there are banks. So they're a bank like, any other sort of institution you would see around, like Citibank or HSBC or so on. But what makes them public are a few things. So one, it can be ownership. A public bank is a bank that's owned by a government. It could be a national government or a state or provincial level government or even a municipal government or some combination of those. And through ownership, it can be public. But you can also understand a public bank through its mandate. So some banks have a binding public purpose mandate, for example, to provide for public services or to provide for farmers or agriculture. But there's also a third way that's important to think about a bank being public, and that's also through governance. So does the bank have official governing authorities on its board of directors? Is there some sort of connection there to government insofar as it giving it a direction or being able to give that bank a direction based on the prevailing government? So a bank can be public through ownership, through a binding public purpose mandate, through governance, or any combination of ownership, mandate, or governance.
I see. So a bank can be privately owned, but still be considered a public bank because of its mandate or governance.
It can be, yeah. So there are a couple of examples like that. One of my favorite examples is the Banco Popular in Costa Rica, which is 100% owned by the working class of Costa Rica, which is set out in law. So it's not actually state or government owned, but it does have a public purpose mandate, and the government sits on the national board of directors. So that would be one clear example where we would identify that institution as a public bank.
See, much of the left is focused on the public sphere, on common goods, right? So to some degree, the word public denotes a kind of a positive and often a kind of a presumptively positive way of going. Are public banks inherently progressive or pro-public entities?
No, public banks are not inherently progressive. They're not inherently anything. It's important to understand them as institutions that are part of society and evolve with society. They're, as I like to call them, dynamic entities. And so they're not, inherently good or bad, but they're only really as good as society commands them to be. But they're definitely, especially at this current moment, with the climate crisis, post-COVID, and with a whole bunch of developmental and infrastructure challenges in the future, they're entities that are being struggled over. So increasingly, private investors really want to capture the power and the resources and the financial capacity that public banks have to use for their own private purposes. So what a public bank does, for whom, why it does it, remains a matter of history. It remains a matter of struggle. And who wins that or who prevails at a certain time, is really a conjunctural question.
Give us an example of how a public bank can be influenced or manipulated by private corporate interests.
So I'll draw on a Canadian example. So in 2017, the Canadian government created the new Canada Infrastructure Bank. And they created it to support the building of infrastructure across Canada, to fill that infrastructure gap type thing, which, sounds great. But it was done under the guidance and with the support of BlackRock, an institutional investor. And in consequence, in law, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, its mandate is essentially to use public money to leverage private investment, and to mobilize private investors in infrastructure across Canada. And so initially, it was very much a vehicle of privatization. There was a lot of resistance around that. The Canadian Union of Public Employees pushed back against a lot of that. And in consequence, actually, the Canada Infrastructure Bank has done a lot more in recent years around public-public collaborations. So working with municipalities to support low-carbon buses, to support energy infrastructure, as well as with First Nations in Canada to support their own infrastructure. So it's actually evolved in a more positive way. But this notion of using public money through public banks to de-risk or blend or to maximize private finance is really the dominant narrative that we hear nowadays in the multilateral spheres about what the proper role of a public bank is, which is to leverage private finance.
Let's go back in history. How long have public banks been around?
Public banks in different forms have been around for 2 or 3 millennia, going back to ancient Babylonian times in Sumeria. But in terms of more modern times, the first public bank was a municipal bank, and it was called the Taula de Ciutats in Barcelona, and it was created in 1401. And I believe it prevailed for about 300 years before they shut it down. And it was created essentially to help that city state manage its own internal finances. And through the 1600s, 1700s, various other types of municipal and city banks emerged throughout Europe. And then into the late 1800s and early 1900s, you begin to see an expansion of public banks around the world. I mean, really in Europe, but including in the colonies, in the US, and so on, around agricultural banks, investment banks, postal banks. And then in particular, through the post-war period, you see an explosion in public development banks, banks which are geared towards investing in large-scale infrastructure. And a lot of that had to do with the devastation in Europe, the destruction of all the energy supply systems, of the housing stock, and so on. And so a lot of these post-war development banks really took charge of rebuilding society, literally rebuilding the infrastructure and the housing stock and the business and corporate base of these societies after the devastation of World War II. And following World War II and then into the 1960s and so on, you see a big decolonization push, and there was a pretty widespread push for nationalizing private banks or European banks in the global south. So taking over private entities or European entities and making them state-owned. And you can see that everywhere from Cuba to India to Vietnam to across Africa. It was pretty widespread movement at that time to wrestle back control of the financial system to be able to pursue questions of national developmentalism, and in many cases really seen as a linchpin to domestic economic and political sovereignty.
What's happened to public banking in the past 4 decades or so, a time of neoliberalization?
So in the last 4 decades, or say since the 1980s, there was an initial strong push through the period of initial neoliberal restructuring or structural adjustment programs to privatize everything. And public banks, in many cases, were thrown into that mix. So privatize whatever happened to be, within the state apparatus to try to be able to repay the debts, acquired through the 1980s debt crisis and so on. And to be honest, public banks are not perfect. A number of them around the world found themselves in fairly bad financial situations. Their governance structures were not necessarily transparent and accountable, and definitely there are cases of public banks being abused by government leaders, by elites, in all kinds of different ways. And so many of those were privatized or sold off or lost. But they certainly did not eliminate public banks in any meaningful way. The strongest of them and the largest of them remained intact and remained important parts of political economies around the world. And so, just to share a little bit of data, we ran the numbers just a few months ago. And so in 2025, there's still 914 public banks around the world. So that's at the national or subnational scale. So 914 that have a total of $55 trillion in combined assets. So to put that in context, that's 10% greater than the GDP of the US, Germany, and China combined. So in no means has neoliberalism or 40 years of market-oriented development done away with public banks. And in fact, over the last 10 to 15 years, something like 30 or 40 new public banks have been created around the world to support countries who are trying to, develop in different ways or to support ambitions. And quite a lot of them are taking on green mandates. And I think in many ways, the debate around public banks in terms of privatization has been won. Nobody's really talking about the privatization of public or state-owned banks anymore. Now it is much more about, as we discussed, this question of is the proper role of a public bank to de-risk or to blend with private finance, or should we be thinking about more pro-public purposes of public banks? How can we get them to work better in collaboration with other public banks, with public services, with the government, with municipalities to support the kinds of projects, infrastructure, housing that we want to see done, but on terms that are appropriate for our communities, that are not extortionary, and any returns that the public banks earn that are not siphoned off to some foreign corporate owner or paid out in dividends to an already wealthy elite, but they go back to the public bank, and then the owners of that bank, which is the government or the governing authorities, decide, do you use that money for further lending or concessional lending or to cross-subsidize lending, or do we decide to pay out a dividend to the government itself? And therefore the government makes a return on the activities of that bank.
I see that there are at least three kinds of public banks: public development banks, public commercial banks, and public universal banks. Can you describe each of these three types?
Sure. Public retail or commercial banks are your kind of everyday bank that you would expect to see on your street corner. We get your paychecks deposited in there. You could hold whatever savings you might have, write checks, get a mortgage. It's your day-to-day bank. And they're actually quite numerous in terms of the public banks around the world. There are probably about 500 of those around the world with around 40 trillion in assets. So they're the largest group of public banks. And they are typically more in the global south, in China, in Brazil, in India, and so on. They're very large, very powerful institutions. An example of a public commercial bank in Canada, we have one that's called the Alberta Treasury Branch. That's in the province of Alberta. In Brazil, they have one that's called the Caixa Econômica. Very large, very powerful institution. And in Germany, they have a public savings bank called the Sparkassen. Absolutely massive, has about $2 trillion in assets. And it's your day-to-day bank. But they don't deal in large-scale infrastructure investment, big developmental deals. They tend to be more, focused on individual customers.
Right, and so that's a good lead into public development banks?
Yes. So public development banks are different from the public commercial retail banks in that they don't take deposits. They don't deal in, individual accounts or mortgages. They are focused more on large scale infrastructure or industry type of investments on a more institutional basis. So they will lend to municipal governments, they will lend to other public services. They will even lend to other banks. It's more focused on large scale loans. And, many of them would not deal in a loan, anything less than many millions of dollars, for example. So it's really about big infrastructure, big projects, big industry, by and large. That said, there is a subset, an important subset of public development banks that focus on small and medium-sized enterprises. So in Canada, we have something called the Business Development Bank of Canada that focuses on, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises. And there are dozens of those kinds of development banks around the world, really, targeting the small business owner, including cooperatives and other social enterprises.
And the third category, public universal banks. These are the kinds of banks that do both, right? That they sort of take deposits and do kind of the daily banking thing, and they make investments, correct?
Yes. Public universal banks combine the functions of the commercial retail banks, so they provide checking accounts and bank cards and mortgages, but they will also provide more developmental functions. So there are a number of agricultural universal banks that support farmers, or small and medium-sized enterprise universal banks.
One might expect that socialist critiques and analyses over the years have brought up public banks as possible agents of transformation. And yet you assert that radical critiques have generally ignored the potential or even the existence of public banks. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, there is a remarkably small literature on public banks, despite a centuries old history, despite that they have many trillions of dollars in assets, and despite the fact that they have long existed within the public sphere. There's really relatively little writing about them. And while I can't claim to have searched every nook and cranny or reviewed every political program of left parties around the world, and I would be more than happy to support a graduate student who wanted to do that at my university. By and large, there's been a fairly large silence on the question of financial alternatives. Public banks being the largest silence of all. Um, and I point back to Lenin. He identifies the importance of taking control of the banks, and really as one of the first priorities, and sees that the institution of banking as such a critical institution for the development of a socialist society, and really highlights that in 1917. And then, really after that, Hilferding talks a little bit about that as well in terms of, nationalizing the banks, but it's all fairly high level and obscure. And there's relatively little discussion about the histories or the content or the struggles of different public banks or public banking or nationalization or decolonial struggles in sort of the post-war era. And I'm sure some exist out there, and I'm happy for anyone to correct me on that. But then we really get stuck after the 1980s and especially into the 1990s, once neoliberalism has taken a firmer grip or hold on academia and critical scholarship, where leftist scholars, socialist scholars get caught in critique alone. They provide incisive, thoughtful, critical analyses of the problems of contemporary finance capital or financialization or whatever you want to call it, and the structural power that it wields and the challenges that it poses for left programs, but with no hint of what's to be done. And in many cases, there's an outright blindness that there is a significant portion of the banks in this world that are in fact publicly owned. And I think that has really undermined left critical struggles, because no matter what struggle you're looking at, be it environmental justice or questions of economic justice or economic democracy, or thinking about the need for more effective public services to overcome gender inequality, finance is at the core of it. All of these things require money, and they require supportive forms of financing and money. And no doubt, I'd argue nowhere that public banks are a silver bullet and they're going to solve all of our problems, or that they're magic money trees. But they become and are very powerful legacy institutions that do have command over money and can direct money to certain projects, certain priorities of society, and do so in a way that is more enabling of these projects to be realized, be it public infrastructure or the support of cooperatives or social enterprises or environmental projects and so on. And they don't need to do it on a profit maximization basis. Public banks don't need to be profit maximizing. They don't need to turn a profit a day in their lives. They need to break even. They need to pay their expenses and pay their employees, and they need to cover for any losses they might incur.
You are concerned, as many of us are, with how a green and just transition can be encouraged, can be catalyzed in the face of this sort of crisis of climate finance. To what extent do mainstream strategies for financing climate transitions look to rely on private investors and private capital?
Mainstream strategies for climate action or sustainable development, or whatever you want to call it, still disproportionately believe that the private sector is the solution to the climate crisis. And that if we could only, encourage more private investment in energy, water, health, transportation, then we can grow our way out of the current crisis. And the only real barrier is enticing them into that sector. And so then that's where the idea of blending public money, cheaper public money with more costly private money, should unlock trillions of private investment. That's the World Bank's billions to trillions agenda. And everyone who is thoughtfully read around this, including any number of mainstream economists, have recognized that the billions to trillions agenda has utterly failed, that it's more billions to millions. You put billions of public money in and you only get millions in return, because much of it gets siphoned off. So there's still a huge faith in the private sector. In practice, though, if you look at track data on climate finance, the most recent data from 2023 from the Climate Policy Initiative, you can see that public investors are far outstripping private sector investment in terms of tracked climate finance. And I might get the numbers slightly wrong, but I believe in 2022-23, all combined private investors, institutional investors, banks, commercial banks, they had put in something like $420 billion in trackable climate finance. Combined public investors, including the variety of public banks, bilateral agencies, and so on, had put in $760 billion. So significantly more investment is coming through the public sector in terms of tracked climate finance than the private sector. And this is despite the fact that the private sector has 5 times the combined assets of the public financial institutions. So public financial institutions have about 20%, 15 to 20%, depending on how you measure it exactly, of all financial assets around the world. And yet they're almost doubling the amount of climate investment, trackable climate finance, as all combined private investors. So they're the leaders in this game, very much. And they're able to really provide significant benefits in the way that they lend, offering subsidized interest rates or blending it with grants, as well as technical assistance and expertise, longer terms of repayment, a whole range of benefits. And they can also actually do much, much more if they're working in much better collaboration with government in terms of planning what needs to be done.
Well, what also requires further action, in your view, is the definancialization and democratization of public banks, because as you said earlier, public banks are not inherently pro-public or progressive. So let's talk about democratization first. What does democratization look like in the context of public banking, the kind of democratization you would advocate?
So, in my view, democratization of public banks holds some of the greatest potential. And what I mean by that is the ability of the affected community or society to exert meaningful command over the resources that a public bank uses or loans or makes use of. And at the same time holds that bank accountable for the proper use of those funds. I think that is probably best exercised at the level of the board of governors or the management board or supervisory board, whatever you want to call it, but at the level of the board, where you set a direction for the bank based on the viewpoints from the society in which you live. You then hold that bank to account for delivering on that vision, and if it doesn't, then you have the capacity to make changes in that public bank itself. At the same time, it's important that, as in any industry or business or corporation, that workers also have some sense of autonomy and ability to make decisions over the workplace. And so the experts who work in the bank, their knowledge, their expertise, their technical capacity should also be valued. So it's not that you want the governing board to have daily decisions and to be peering over the shoulders of everybody working in the bank every day. I don't think that achieves much.
So, give us an example or two of a public bank that operates in a notably democratic manner.
So the most democratic bank in the world, in my view, is the Banco Popular in Costa Rica. So it has a very unique workers' assembly of 290 members taken from 10 different social sectors in Costa Rica who elect their members to this 290 member assembly, which by law must have gender parity of at least 50% women. Then it's the National Board of Directors, has 7 members on it. 4 are elected from the Workers' Assembly, and 3 come from government. And in that space too, there also has to be gender parity of at least 50% gender equity. And one year it might be 4 men and 3 women, but then the next year or 2 years it needs to be 4 women, 3 men. And so that is an extremely democratic institution. That sort of has mechanisms by which society is able to exert control over the resources held within that institution. Another really interesting example is in the Globe North, the German Development Bank, the KfW. It has a 37-member board of directors. I think it's called a supervisory board, where they have quite a number of government ministers sitting on the board alongside members of trade unions, of business, of cooperatives, of teachers, and so on, all set out in law. Then this 37-member board of directors that then gives direction to the bank, what it can and what it should be doing, and then also holds that bank to account. So it really is an example of the democratization of the economy. Is it perfect? Probably not. Are there ways of improving it? I'm sure there are. But there are few areas of such economic power that I can think of where there is in fact a form of democracy being exerted, and one that has such a significant impact within society in terms of the resources that it commands, for the financial resources that it commands.
You were saying earlier, Thomas, about how some public banks are public by virtue of their mandate or governance and not by virtue of their ownership. How important in your mind is pursuing outright public ownership of banks in the effort to democratize them?
Ownership is really important. There's no escaping that. And the example I give of the Banco Popular that is not in fact publicly owned but owned by workers, it's kind of like a cooperative bank, but not at the same time. It's a weird sort of institution. But really, in most cases, public banks at base are publicly owned institutions. And ownership does confer important abilities of owners to shape and to give direction to that institution. But you also don't want to let that blind you to the different forms by which different communities and societies have created alternative financial institutions around the world that may well and can serve the public interest in important and meaningful ways. The Banque Populaire is one example.
There's been a lot of discussion of the financialization of the global economy and certainly concerns over the growing power of finance capital. You stress the importance of the definancialization of public banks. What does that mean, and what concretely would it take to definancialize public banking institutions?
For me, definancialization is really about being able to exert control over the flows of capital within your institution, and fundamentally about being able to, shape where those flows are going and to decide the pace at which it's flowing. So financialization, our critique of it, is very much about how money flows very quickly in and out of countries, in and out of communities, in and out of businesses, and it does so at a very aggressive profit maximization intent. And in that sort of fast flow of profit maximizing capital, you see that it tries to bend the logic of every institution, community, entity that it enters into to the logic of finance and of financial accumulation. So if a private, institutional investor invest in a community water project or a national water project, their primary concern is not delivering clean, universal access to drinkable water, but about driving quarterly returns. So definancialization in many ways is the opposite of that. First and foremost, it's about thinking about public banks and the use of the money not as profit maximizing, but as policy maximizing, as in oriented towards providing clean, universal drinking water, not to generate, the maximum return for the public bank, but to deliver on the mandate of, helping a community have safe drinking, affordable water. And that's where its measure of success comes from, is delivering the water, not delivering the profit. And a really key aspect of definancialization, and in many ways how I talk about it in the book, is it has to do with time. And the fact that, through policy, through a policy decision in a public bank, because you're able to exert command over flows of money, you can make time available. You can slow the pace, the speed at which capital enters into a city or a municipality or into a public service, and you can hold it there and leave it there for a period of time that makes sense for the success of that water project or that green energy project or that school or whatever else they're investing in. And so it's really about slowing the pace of the flow of capital and be able to hold it in a particular space. And often that has to be done through a mandate or through policy guidance. And so you can look at institutions around the world that in many ways by design definancialized. So in the book, in the 2021 book, I look at the Bank of North Dakota, which is a state level, subnational state level public bank in the state of North Dakota in the United States. And in many ways, it's a very definancialized institution. It only invests within the borders, the geographical borders of North Dakota. It doesn't really have it doesn't have a profit maximizing mandate at all. There are contradictions and issues in every bank, but it's really in many ways meant, the way it releases and uses its capital, is meant to foster the priorities of development and so on within the state. And should you want, we can talk about some of the problems of the Bank of North Dakota, particularly in terms of pipelines and the oil industry. But it would not be alone in the contradictions of its existence, and that's not to excuse it or anything like that. But there's other examples. And so I'd mentioned earlier the German Sparkassen, which are local public savings banks. They similarly have a geographical mandate to reinvest money, to make loans, and to support their communities within. They're more of a municipal type bank. So within the sort of their geographical limits. And that puts certain brakes on what the Sparkassen can do with the resources that they have within its bank, in a way that sort of prevents them from speculating on global financial markets or purchasing mortgage-backed securities in the UK, or other exotic instruments like that. So the question then of definancialization is really very much linked to the question of mandate and directing, as a matter of policy rather than a matter of profit, the use of those funds, and having then that use of the funds being held in certain meaningful ways to a different standard of account. Have you delivered on local development? Have you supported local schools? Have you enabled the development of clean drinking water within our community, which is something that's fundamentally different than the financialized metrics of most institutional investors today?
So, on the level of what you might call grassroots activism, because you want to get people involved and you want to educate people about what public banks are, but also how they might be transformed or reformed. You write of the need for people in a locality to get to know the public banking capacity within their communities, right? So, what are the institutions? Which are public banks? What is the status of those banks in terms of ownership and mandate and governance? Are they working toward certain goals, pro-public goals, or not? And so once those public banks are identified by, let's say, local activists or local institutions, what are you saying those institutions or people can do in terms of making change, in terms of making proposals or requests or demands on public banks in their area?
I think it's really important that people have a clear grasp of the public economic resources held within their community. And should there be public banks in their city, in their state or province, or in their nation, then these are institutions that they should really be aware of and know what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. And so, as you said, job one is to really educate yourself about that institution. What is its mandate? Who is it trying to fund? And where is it funding? And what are the terms of it? And so on. And if they're doing things that you like and things that you support, supporting for high quality public services, providing for just energy transition, supporting decent jobs in your community, then you should be, vocal about that and raise that with your local political representatives, and talk to your local radio stations, because it's important that we celebrate the wins. But likewise, if you really don't know what the public bank is doing, if it's unaccountable and there's a lack of transparency, or worse yet, if that institution is investing in military hardware, is it subsidizing oil production? Is it providing funding, even subsidized funding for activities that might be damaging our ecosystem or biodiversity? Then these need to be exposed, and these entities need to be held accountable for that. And this is where the ownership matters. And if your city council owns the municipal bank, or if your state or province owns the subnational bank, or your national government owns that national development bank, then you can raise these questions with your political representatives and start asking questions of your newspapers and those sort of reporters out there, and say, what's going on, and can we look into this? Because these institutions can and do change, but they only change if we command that of them. And to do that, we need to expose them to public and critical scrutiny. And that was really, again, in the case of the German KfW, it was in the late 1990s, with the entry of the Green Party into a coalition government that led to a fundamental transformation of that institution. And it's a huge institution. I'm blanking on the exact number, but it has over 500 billion euros in assets. It's an enormous public development bank. And now it's considered one of the greenest banks in the world, public or private. Does a lot of really interesting work, supports municipal regeneration, even student loans. And it does that because of the pressure that was put on it by society through through the government owners. And there are other examples of that around the world where crises have emerged within societies, and those countries or regions that had public banks were able to respond to that crisis because they had that capacity within their reach, and because they could respond as a matter of policy rather than a matter of profit. Now, neoclassical and neoliberal advocates will say this is the politicization of the economy, and that all public banks are inherently corrupt and inefficient, and you should only let the market decide on what a bank does and what it doesn't do. And this is really some pretty fundamentally flawed thinking. It doesn't reflect the challenges that we face globally and within our own communities in terms of the need for energy transitions, for decent jobs, which really require a significant level of planning and thought. And at the center of that has to be supportive finance. And if we want that, if we want these institutions to reflect our values and our priorities, then we have to expose them to public oversight, and we need to ask questions of them. And when they're doing great, we need to celebrate that. And when they're not, then we need to challenge it.
Thomas Marois, again spelled Marois. On our website, againstthegrain.org, we have a link to his faculty page at McMaster University in Canada, where he teaches political economy, as well as a link to the volume Socialist Register 2025, in which you can find an article he co-authored with Susan Spronk about public banks, as well as to his 2021 book, Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization. Thomas, thanks very much for your important work and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
They fought to secure the vote for women. They used direct action, civil disobedience, and increasingly militant tactics to pursue their goals. My guest today contends that what a group of British suffragettes did more than a century ago matters to contemporary activism, including climate activism. Feyzi Ismail teaches global policy and activism at Goldsmiths, University of London. She is also active in the British anti-war and trade union movements. Feyzi's essay, The Climate Movement, the Suffragettes, and the Meaning of Militancy, is part of the volume Socialist Register 2025, Openings and Closures, co-edited by Gregory Albo and Stephen Maher. In her article, Feyzi considers the activities of, among other folks, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel, co-founders of the Women's Social and Political Union in the UK. When Feyzi, Ismail, and I connected recently, I asked what spurred her to consider and compare the climate and suffragette movements.
I thought it was interesting how the British mainstream media made so many comparisons with the suffragettes and the climate protesters, but then how much of the climate movement itself embraced the comparison, and particularly the nonviolent direct action end of the climate movement, which is the sort of dominant end, I would say. It's hard to say whether they were embracing the suffragettes, knowing the history of the suffragettes, or perhaps they knew the history and argued, well, you know, times have changed and we have to reject property destruction. And then I also thought it was interesting how on the other side, Andreas Malm, in his book How to Blow Up a Pipeline, also draws on the suffragettes, quite uncritically, I think, to make the case for property destruction. And I would say perhaps we can consider those two poles, the one on the one hand, the nonviolent direct action end of the climate movement, and the property destruction side of the climate movement, which is of course, you know, a much smaller end, kind of constitute the sort of radical sort of end of the climate movement. So I wanted to look at really whether we should be drawing on the suffragettes. What can we learn from them, and what might we rethink? And of course, the suffragettes are the ones remembered for having got women the vote. Whether that's actually true or not, they are remembered for that, and that's important. In a way, it's like whether that was actually true or not is sort of secondary, but it's also important, I think, to have a closer reading of history. What did they actually do, and how did they organize, and what made them effective or not, and what were their weaknesses, and you know, what was the context in which they were operating. And I thought this question of how the politics informed the tactics was interesting.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the history of the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU, as a women's suffrage organization founded in 1903 in the UK. Did the WSPU in its early years show a willingness to work with political parties and with organized labor?
In the beginning, they did. They had links with the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, and they had initially campaigned for ILP candidates in elections, and they had convinced the ILP to back women's suffrage, and they did. But then, as I note, during the Cockermouth by-election in 1906, they changed tack, and they declared that they would remain independent of any party. And I argue that this was significant because it was really a break from organized labor, and it was a break from their links with Northern socialism. I mean, initially they did try and attract working class women, you know, in and around Manchester, but everywhere where they had branches, to the WSPU, to the movement. But yeah, it was that election where they said, we're not going to back anyone, regardless of even whether they supported women's suffrage. So, you know, they were particularly opposed to the Liberals, but they also opposed socialist candidates in the ILP.
And why was that? What accounts for this decision to not work with or endorse political parties?
I think it was an evolution of tactical differences. I think it was, for example, the East London Federation of the WSPU, the East London sort of branch of the WSPU. They were getting more into, under Sylvia Pankhurst's leadership, who was Emmeline Pankhurst's middle daughter, so the younger sister of Christabel Pankhurst. She was more interested in mass mobilization on a kind of working class basis. So she had put down quite deep roots in the area. She worked with working class women and men on very concrete issues that would affect their lives, that would have a beneficial effect on their lives, concrete activities. And she was gaining increasing popularity for that. They had some gains, concrete gains in the lives of ordinary people, but also at national level. And this was even earlier than that, this sort of break. But I think that the WSPU, it was 3 years into their establishment, and I think they felt a kind of impatience for not having got the vote yet. And they felt that more militant tactics would be the way to go, rather than engaging in politics, political parties, etc. They were more interested in building their own organization and growing it to the point where they could appeal to all classes of women, so that they wouldn't need the ILP anymore. And initially, in the early years, I think, they were interested in being popular. I argue eventually the tactics that they chose reflected the fact that they didn't care about being popular, but initially they did. And they were popular.
You recount a number of situations, circumstances, actions in 1905, 1907, 1908. Tell us about some of the notable uses of militant tactics by the WSPU, again, the Women's Social and Political Union, a British women's suffrage organization. Talk about, the development toward militancy.
They had initially used a range of tactics, from direct action to mass demonstrations and so on. The first kind of, in the literature, the first notable use of militant tactics was in 1905, and it was at a Liberal Party rally in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, at, I think, which Winston Churchill was at as well. And they had questioned publicly Sir Edward Grey, who was a Liberal Party politician, essentially making some noise where they were sitting in the hall and unfurling a banner in the middle of his speech and shouting, "Will the Liberal government give women the vote?" And, of course, people around them were telling them to sit down and sort of harassing them and so on. And they persevered until they were, of course, thrown out and then arrested. And they chose imprisonment rather than paying a fine. But you can imagine this was a very brave thing to do, in a sense. It was unprecedented. It defied all prevailing norms of what women were supposed to be like in public, what kind of a role women were to play in British politics, and so on. And it was met with broad approval from many women. It drew women into the WSPU, into the wider suffrage movement. And on the other side, from the WSPU's part, this is the kind of action that they wanted. These are the kind of disruptive tactics they wanted to adopt more and more. In part because they wanted the national attention, they wanted the media to talk about them, and the media was talking about them. So that was, in a way, the sort of turning point 2 years in from their establishment.
And then in 1907, they stormed Parliament. And in 1908, they organized what became known as Women's Sunday. You can certainly talk about the storming of the Parliament, but I'm especially interested in what happened on Women's Sunday.
Yeah, so it's not that when they sort of made this initial turn towards more militant tactics that they didn't do all the kind of mass collective action. There were still a few more years in which they did engage in mass collective action. So the point about the sort of militancy and the kind of militant tactics and the publicity and the kind of national attention was that in a way it had to escalate in order for that attention to be sustained. So they thought of more and more militant actions. They thought of different kinds of actions and so on. So yes, in 1907, they got a delegation of several hundred women to essentially, surround Parliament. In 1908, they organised Women's Sunday, what became known as Women's Sunday, and it was huge. I mean, at the time, it was the biggest demonstration. Some 500,000 people, and then tens of thousands of women marched to Hyde Park. And if you look on the Hyde Park website, it still has a bit about the suffragettes and what happened on that day in a kind of a proud way. Look what the suffragettes did. This is part of our history. And it was interesting about Women's Sunday because they weren't granted the vote. After that massive demonstration, there was real frustration on the part of the WSPU, its leadership, and the women activists involved. 2 women activists in particular threw stones at Downing Street a few days after Women's Sunday in a way to express this frustration. But it was interesting what the leadership had said. Christabel Pankhurst, who was the sort of chief ideologue of the WSPU, her position was that if that is the sort of pinnacle of a mass demonstration or a mass meeting, and we really can't do better than that, and if that doesn't get us a vote, then basically the tactic of the demonstration is exhausted. Her conclusion was that, well, what's the point of doing mass demonstrations? Now, of course, I think in a way that's the wrong conclusion. And we know it doesn't work like that. I mean, there were millions around the world that marched in 2003 against the Iraq War. They still went ahead. One conclusion could be that, or maybe Christabel would have drawn the conclusion, okay, let's not march anymore because that tactic doesn't work, basically. I think another conclusion, I think the right conclusion must be that, well, we need to make it bigger. We need to keep going. It's not the case that just because we march that the government says, oh, well, all right, you're right, and will relent. It takes place over a whole kind of over time and sustained pressure and so on and on.
Let's move to 1910 when 300 women marched on Parliament. They were protesting, I think, the failure of a bill that proposed granting certain women, propertied women, the right to vote. What did they do in this action, and how did the police respond?
This is a turning point in the history of the suffragettes, and it was called Black Friday. They called it Black Friday, and they were protesting against the failure of the 1910 conciliation bill. And essentially it was proposing granting propertied women the right to vote, but it had failed to move through Parliament. So they said that it was going to be heard, and then it wasn't. And that, of course, was a source of huge frustration on the part of the WSPU 7 years now into their campaign and the establishment of their organization. So they decided to march on Parliament with a view to having a kind of women's Parliament that would hear the bill and so on, and that would sort of put their case. And so there were 300 women that marched on Parliament, and for 6 hours they were basically brutalized by the police. They were beaten and kicked and sexually assaulted. Emmeline's sister eventually died of her injuries, and at least one or two other women died of their injuries. It was a real kind of expression of the extent to which the state would go to repress protest around women's right to vote. And the suffragettes were taking real risks and were seen as very brave. But after that day, the leadership, partly in response, then escalated these militant tactics. So now it wasn't just about disrupting public meetings and so on. It was a very determined window smashing campaign. They vandalized public statues, paintings in the National Gallery. They would blow up letterboxes. They would chain themselves to railing, fight with the police, and so on and on. And it wasn't a tactic, but when they were imprisoned for such activity, they would go on hunger strike. And then they had, at that point, suffered absolutely ruthless forms of force feeding. And that was something that the media made. Of course, the right-wing media portrayed the suffragettes as kind of unreasonable and almost like this is what they deserve. And the kind of more sympathetic liberal media had looked upon this with some sympathy, that they shouldn't be treated like this. And actually, there were some MPs who tried to get Parliament to ban this, but it didn't get very far. It continued, but there was a lot of talk about it, and it just drew more and more attention to the suffragettes and the lengths that they were willing to go to get the right to vote.
And how did the movement leadership, and again, we're talking about the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU, a women's suffrage organization founded in 1903 in the UK. And so how did the WSPU leadership justify their escalating militancy? Did they argue that, hey, mass demonstrations didn't work, as you said? Was that the primary gist of how they supported or justified their trajectory?
Yeah. After Women's Sunday, they had concluded that mass demonstrations aren't the tactic that's going to get us the right to vote. We need to put far more pressure on the government, and we need to disrupt business as usual. We need to disrupt the status quo and the lives of ordinary people in order that they would also put some pressure on the government. And that was to be done through militant tactics. And what I argue in the article is that the problem with it is, or one of the problems with it is that it tends to travel in one direction, this type of protest, because the more the Asquith government refused to pay attention to votes for women, the more desperate the actions became. So again, they had to escalate, not just because they wanted the national attention and the popularity and so on. And that was a good thing to want, to draw attention to the movement. But their version of escalation, their brand of militancy, was to engage in more and more daring, I suppose, forms of property destruction. So, it was the window smashing, it was the blowing up the letterboxes, it was, vandalizing statues and paintings and so on. And then it became arson attacks, it became placing bombs on trains and in railway stations and so on. And at that point, they started to lose people. There's one suffrage movement historian, Andrew Rosen, writes that by 1913, their membership, the rate of membership, of new memberships, began to decline. Actually, from 1909, he says, but by 1913, it was around 42% fall in new memberships. And he argues that the arson campaign was probably the biggest single factor that fostered the decline, because people, then it became sort of, it had this element where you're not involving the mass of the population. This kind of tactic is relying on fewer and fewer women, individual brave women, it has to be said, but it becomes more about sort of individual heroism rather than about a collective mass movement that can put pressure.
Yeah, and you're right that emphasizing individual bravery over collective action meant that the tactics of this group began to reflect, or was an indication of the class position of the WSPU leadership. Elaborate on that.
Yeah, so Emmeline Pankhurst and her family were from a sort of middle upper class family from Manchester. Her parents were involved in political campaigning. They were quite involved in the setup of the Independent Labour Party, and they had raised their children to be involved in politics and so on. Emmeline famously started reading at the age of 3. She came to meetings with her parents and so on, and she grew up understanding that women didn't have all the opportunities that men had. She couldn't pursue education as far as her brothers could, and so on. So she grew up in that kind of milieu. They had a big house in Manchester and so on. They would have meetings at their house and so on. And by the time Emmeline moved the WSPU from Manchester to London, in part, I think, in order to sort of oversee what was going on in East London with Sylvia Pankhurst's activities, with her daughter's activities in the East London branch. But in part, for a national organisation, you have to be in London. That coincided with their move towards more militant tactics. But I do think that, those tactics were adopted in a way because they could deal with the consequences of arrest and imprisonment better than other women could because of their class position. So they could afford bail. They did spend time in prison, particularly Emmeline, as opposed to Christabel. I'm not sure Christabel spent any time in prison, actually. But they could afford arrest, essentially. They had people to do things for them. They had the money for bail and so on. Christabel moved to Paris to avoid arrest, and she worked for the WSPU from there. She would essentially direct the organization from there. So I think it did reflect their class position, the kind of tactics they adopted. They didn't need mass action, and not just that, but their politics in general, their ideological positions. I mean, Christabel famously had said that, and I quote this in the article, that working women's lives were too hard, their education was too meager to equip them for the struggle, and so we don't want the weakest for the struggle. We want picked women, the very strongest and the most intelligent. And that kind of thinking, I think, was really a rejection of working class women in the movement. She didn't see the value of collective action. So that wasn't going to be part of the strategy. They, according to Christabel's idea, it was, we want women who are unconditionally loyal to the organization. We want women who are unconditionally committed to women's right to vote, and nothing else matters. So it's not about a wider emancipatory project, because, of course, from their perspective, they don't need a wider emancipatory project around, economic questions. For them, it was a very specific political question. And I think that also chimes with their position on how women were to be included in the right to vote. It was propertied women. They were absolutely in favor of only propertied women over 30, because that was the proposal. That was the first proposal in the conciliation bill, that only propertied women over the age of 30 would get the vote. And the WSPU were on board with that. They didn't argue, for example, like other socialists did, that we need universal suffrage.
You also write about the effect that the WSPU's escalating militancy had on its willingness to engage in internal democracy, and its and this is related to it, no doubt, the secrecy and, in some sense, the conspiratorial elements that go along with planning the kinds of things that they were planning. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, famously, Emmeline had argued with Christabel that militant tactics had necessitated an autocratic structure. And they put it like this: an army does not elect its generals. And while that's true, it also isn't the way to run a movement. And they, in fact, rejected democratic structures as early as 1907, which was only 4 years into their establishment. So at that point, they had cancelled the annual conference and abandoned the WSPU constitution. And they did it because they were seeking absolute loyalty with their strategy and tactics. So the strategy and tactics of coming out of the heads of Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. And if you didn't agree with that, basically you didn't really have a say in the leadership. So they didn't really want broad-based discussion and consensus. They didn't want to talk about what next, or how we should move forward as an organization in a kind of democratic national conference or series of conferences or meetings and so on. They preferred to say, okay, this is what's happening, this is the policy, and the branches need to do X, Y, and Z. And that led to a split in the WSPU, creating the Women's Freedom League. This new organization, the WFL, was explicit about operating on a democratic basis with internal elections and so on. And they were very much, they were very conscious of organizing in a different way than the WSPU. And quite a few women left with them, expressing some anxiety around the contradiction between fighting for a democratic reform around the right to vote and not doing it in a democratic organization. So that wasn't that was the direction that the WSPU was moving, and they were moving in that direction as a result of the tactics. So, of course, if you're going to engage in arson and bombing campaigns, you are going to have a level of secrecy. So it's understandable at that level, but it does necessitate a different kind of organization. And I suppose the question is, what kind of an effect does that have on the organization? Again, I think it means that you rely on fewer and fewer women to carry out those actions. You have to have loyalists in the organization, and you have to be able to deal with the repression that comes about as a result of it. And on the other hand, the question of popularity was also coming to the fore, because it wasn't just that the membership was declining, but the WSPU was losing popular support. At one point, it had held something like, and this was in Paul Foot's brilliant book on called The Vote. They had held something like 100,000 meetings over the space of a few years. In the first 6 years of its existence, so between 1903 and 1909, they'd filled the largest hall in London, the Royal Albert Hall, 13 times. I mean, it fits 6,000 people.
You said 100,000 meetings, or do you mean that the meetings over these years had attracted a total of 100,000 people?
No, they had 100,000 meetings.
Wow.
So all the branches across the country, in aggregate, had held 100,000 meetings in the first 6 years of its existence. So it was huge in terms of it being a movement, in terms of it drawing women into the suffrage movement. And for that, the suffragettes, the WSPU needs to be remembered for that. It was a huge strength. They were incredible organizers, extremely committed, and so on. And they valued that popularity. But then the sort of evolution of the tactics, increasingly, they didn't place so much value on that popularity. They were much more focused on the militant tactics that they felt would get them the right to vote.
And again, the WSPU that we are talking about is the Women's Social and Political Union, a British women's suffrage organization founded in 1903. There's so much to talk about. I mean, your article does go into many groups in the suffrage movement who did not agree with the WSPU, who took a very different tack, who made different allies, who thought differently about mass mobilization and working with labor and addressing working people's concerns. But as far as the WSPU's militancy, how would you sum up the effects of that militancy, both on that group and on the wider suffrage movement, the detrimental effects that those kinds of tactics had?
Well, I think it undermined the ability for the mass of the population to participate in the movement, and I think that weakened the movement. It sort of allowed the government to drive a wedge between the WSPU activists and the wider population, in part by putting them into prison and so on, and that sort of alienated existing and or much existing and potential working class support, and I think operating on a kind of more of an internal basis with very little democracy and so on, very little or no democracy. I think it was difficult then for activists within the movement to make connections between different struggles. I think the struggles that were happening, the mass labor unrest, the Irish struggle, it was more difficult for them to reach out to the WSPU in particular. But of course, the WSPU wasn't the only part of the suffrage movement. There were other organizations, and there was evidence of some tenuous links. Ralph Darlington writes about this, but it made it very difficult for the WSPU's position. They weren't reaching out to working people. They had this position about what working people were like, and that they couldn't contribute to this movement in a way that in a way that more middle class and elite women could. And that, of course, weakened the connections that could be made.
Indeed. And then if we move quite a bit forward to today's climate movement and the radical end of the climate movement, which you're most interested in, what conclusions can we draw about? I guess a couple things come to mind first. The degree to which direct action and civil disobedience, under what circumstances are those most likely to succeed? And the more general question of lessons learned from the suffragettes in terms of the kind of tactics that need to or should be employed to gain maximum effect.
So first, I should say that I don't foreground this history to sort of say that the history of the suffragettes means that we shouldn't, engage in civil disobedience or mass arrests or even property destruction. I think context will determine, in a sense, the use of any and all of these tactics. But I think those tactics are best deployed in the context of a mass movement that is in the ascendancy and that is led by working people. I mean, we don't want to take away from history that the suffragettes used militant tactics and got the right to vote. Ergo, we should use militant tactics and then we'll get the government to listen on the question of climate. That's not an accurate reading of history, because what happened with the suffragettes was that their militant tactics came at the expense of the mass mobilization. It didn't go hand in hand, nor was it in the context. I mean, I would say that those kind of tactics have to take place in the context of a mass movement, and that's also why I don't think that we should counterpose direct action or non-violent direct action with the mass movements. We need both. We need all kinds of action, but I definitely think that these kind of militant tactics need to happen within the context of an organized mass movement.
Let's look maybe specifically at Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, which split from Extinction Rebellion in 2022 but remains friendly with it. What kinds of things have you seen from these groups that make sense to you based on your understanding of history and of activism generally? And what sorts of things do you feel like are not necessarily productive?
I think where XR and Just Stop Oil have tried to engage the public, I think they have been effective. XR has tried to get tens of thousands of people on the streets. They've succeeded in that a number of times. They raised the alarm in various ways in their history in 2019, in 2021 as well, in terms of organizing international action, coordinated action globally. They managed to get a pink boat in the middle of Oxford Circus for 2 weeks in the middle of London. That was all good. And Just Stop Oil, for their part, they've supported strikes. They've come on anti-austerity demonstrations. They've done all of that. So I think that makes most sense. Where they disrupt the lives of people getting to work, most famously XR activists in I think it was 2019 jumped on the tube train at Canning Town Station in the middle of morning rush hour, and they'd prevented scores of people getting to work. That was just annoying. That doesn't encourage support for the cause. That just I think alienates people. But what's interesting is that XR has essentially run its course. they don't really do anything anymore. And Just Stop Oil has officially wound up over the last few months. So I think there's a kind of admission that in a way that the tactics aren't working and that they need to do something else. What I would like to see is that they try and engage more with mass collective action. And as I say, I don't think that, the slow marching that Just Stop Oil was engaging in, and I don't think all of that can be debated, and the kind of throwing of the tomato soup on the Van Gogh. But is it really, and sure, it's raised awareness, and that's crucial, but is it really getting to where we want to be, which is putting real pressure on the government to change course? And I think the other sort of thing about the climate movement, both XR and Just Stop Oil, is that they've sort of assumed, I think, two things. One is that the public aren't aware of the climate crisis, and therefore we have to raise this awareness, and that we have to talk about how bad it is all the time. And two, that the government is open to being persuaded. And of course, on one level, we have to persuade the government, but on another level, I think we need to focus much more on pressuring, on forcing the government, and putting the government in a very difficult position, in that they are forced to act. But for that, I think the tactics have to also focus on what we can do, the kind of action that we can take. And in a way, it's sort of, I put it like taking things into our own hands. And for that, it means both organizing collectively in the form of mass movements, because those are the things that we can organize, in a democracy. And two is around withdrawing our labor at the point of production. And I know it's not easy, but that is the task. I mean, it is our task in terms of what we have to do.
Withdrawing our labor as in conducting general strikes?
Yeah, conducting strikes. I think it doesn't even have to be, I mean, it would be interesting if it was in the fossil fuel industries, but it doesn't even have to be in those industries. It can be in any industry. It can be in any workplace. But if it's, the mass of teachers withdrawing their labor, not even necessarily for climate demands, but for wages and working conditions, and that then starts to spread to nurses or to other industries or sectors, I think that's when you start to make society ungovernable. The government is on the back foot. You start to be in a position as a movement, particularly if you're making connections, across different sectors and across different sections of the working class and so on, where you are in a position of strength, and you can start to then make demands over the climate. You can make demands over wages and working conditions, but you can also make demands over the climate. And that's where we need to be heading, I think. And that can really only happen with mass collective action. Now, you can then also start to, engage in the other tradition of militancy that I talk about, the kind of the more sort of direct action, even property destruction. You can start to do things, but it only works, I think. It's only able to be organized when you've got a movement that's in the ascendancy, a very, very strong movement that won't be derailed, or won't be, they can't just arrest everybody and put everybody in prison, and won't be subject to repression in the same way that militant tactics in the form of a few arrests and so on can have on a movement. It won't be subject to that kind of repression in the same way.
Given your emphasis on mass mobilizations, are you saying that it really requires more than one movement to accomplish these goals that it requires many movements acting in combination and coordination?
Well, what I argue in the article is that we need to start from the struggles that people are already engaged in. So, for example, we have on the streets today the biggest movement over Palestine. People are very riled up about that. We've had mass demonstrations in this country in which millions of people have participated over the last almost 2 years. And those demonstrations have enabled some of the other actions that have taken place, the occupations, the encampments, other acts, big and small, of solidarity. And it's been the mass demonstrations. The mass demonstrations have been the only tactic that has endured. And when you have such big demonstrations, you can, in a sense, call the shots. I mean, the negotiations with the police, you can say, we want to march here, we want to march there. And when they say, no, you can't do that, then you say, well, what are you going to do? And the police understand that. I mean, they understand that the movement is so big, and the government as well, that they have a very difficult time trying to repress it, and that there have been arrests of two prominent leaders of the Palestine movement in the UK and more now. And depending on what happens with their trial, that could be very damaging for the government if they are imprisoned for any length of time. I think more and more people will come out because they know that that's wrong. The idea that you organize peaceful protest and then get arrested. So that is all happening in the context of mass mobilization. So it's not that I'm saying that many movements have to come together. There are different kinds of movements. Yes, I am saying that we need to make links between them, and that growing a movement makes it such that if we start to win over Palestine, we can make climate demands. I think a lot of people who come on the Palestine demonstrations are against the climate crisis, who are aware of what's happening, and so on and on. But I also think it's not just about the movements; it's also about a real escalation would be withdrawing our labor in the workplace. And that would be an escalation, for example, on Palestine, and it could eventually be an escalation on the climate front as well.
Well, I don't have time to ask about what you say in your article about certain similarities between the suffragettes and the climate protesters, so I'll read that passage now. Quote, "The WSPU's militancy and the militancy of the current climate movement share at least three features: a denial of the need to find broad popular support in wider society, a rejection of an engagement with political parties and politics in general, and an underestimation of the power of the working class to stop production and thereby transform society," unquote. I've been speaking with Feyzi Ismail. You can find the spelling of her name on our website, againstthegrain.org. She is a lecturer in global policy and activism at Goldsmiths, University of London. Feyzi is also active in British trade union and anti-war movements. We've been talking about her article, The Climate Movement, the Suffragettes, and the Meaning of Militancy, which is part of the volume Socialist Register 2025, Openings and Closures, Socialist Strategy at a Crossroads. Feyzi, thanks for your work and for joining us today.
Thank you.
Against the Grain is produced by Sasha Lilly and C.S. Song. You can visit us online at againstthegrain.org, where you'll find on-demand and downloadable audio, resources, and more. Today on Against the Grain, returning privatized services like water and electricity to public control is a global phenomenon. I'm CS. I'll talk with David A. McDonald about the radical political potential of what's called re-municipalization, coming right up. Services like water, transport, electricity, and waste management are essential services. So who or what should own and run them? The left has decried the privatization of services. Does that mean that putting them back into public hands solves the issue? Or if the goal is more equitable, democratic, and non marketized forms of public services, are additional steps needed? David A. McDonald has been studying the return of privatized services to public ownership for many years. A professor of global development studies at Queen's University in Canada, McDonald directs the Municipal Services Project, a global research network that explores progressive forms of public services with a focus on equity, sustainability, and democratic engagement. He's contributed an essay titled Radical Re-municipalizations, Remaking and Reclaiming Public Services to the volume Socialist Register 2025, Openings and Closures, Socialist Strategy at a Crossroads. When David McDonald and I connected recently, I asked what is meant by the term re-municipalization.
It is a term, first of all, that only academics could have come up with. But if you break the word down, re-municipalization really refers to taking particularly municipal public services and making them municipally owned and operated once again after a period of private management. And that can be outright privatization, and it's bought again by the municipality and brought back in-house. And it can also mean contracting a service out for 5 or 10 or 20 years has come to an end, and it's now being brought back in-house. So it's re-municipalizing a service back into public hands that was operated in some form by a for-profit private company. Now, I will say also that it's not simply at the municipal level. These things happen at a national level, they happen at a provincial and state level. So although the term remunicipalization typically covers all of those things, you can have renationalization or reprovincialization or simply republicization. But the gist of it is that it's something that was private and is now being made public.
And what sort of services have been returned to public ownership and management?
Water and electricity, as far as we know, are the most popular. And I'll just preface that by saying, to the best of our knowledge, we have been trying to track these trends for the last 15 years, and particularly colleagues of mine in Amsterdam and University of Glasgow. But there are many, many cases that we just simply don't hear about or know about. But to the extent that we've been able to track over 2,000 cases of it around the world. Water and electricity are the most common, but we also see it happening in waste management, in housing, in transportation services, really a very broad range of things that were privatized quite heavily in the 1990s and 2000s, and often contracts are coming into an end, and so they're being brought back in-house. But certainly water and electricity are amongst the most popular and attract the most attention.
So if remunicipalization is a global phenomenon, does it occur more often, more frequently in certain countries, certain regions?
There are places, regions where it's happening more. Europe and Latin America have seen a fair amount of activity. And within Europe, France and Germany in particular have seen a lot of remunicipalization. And within Latin America, there have been places, Argentina and Bolivia in particular, where we've seen it. But in fact, the United States has also seen a lot of remunicipalization, particularly in the water sector. It's happened all over the world: Africa, Asia, Latin America. But there are probably 6 or 7 countries where it has been more common than others.
You write that remunicipalization can be simultaneously expansive and narrow in scope. Explain what you mean.
Let me start with the question about narrow in scope. what I'm referring to there is that often services are being remunicipalized for quite narrow reasons, and the United States is a good illustration of that. So we've seen a lot of water services brought back into public control in the US, and the reasons for it have been largely due to saving money, and often in quite conservative Republican-led states and municipalities, where bureaucrats in particular have been doing the number crunching and have determined that, in fact, not only is it not cheaper to outsource water services to private companies, but in fact it's more expensive. And the reasons for that are profit taking and the cost of monitoring contracts and putting out tenders for proposals and so on. And so quite conservative, very fiscally minded bureaucrats have made decisions that it's better to bring a service back in-house because it saves money. So that would be an example of a kind of narrow example of remunicipalization. The more expansive forms of remunicipalization are cases where they've been brought back in-house for much bigger political reasons. Democratic control, participatory decision-making, environmental change, social justice, affordability, etc. Now, you don't necessarily get all of these dynamics happening at once, but there are quite expansive forms of remunicipalization where many of these things come into play. And I would say Spain is probably where you see a lot of this happening, and parts of Latin America, where there's a very strong grassroots kind of mobilization amongst citizens and labor unions, etc., who are pushing very hard to have services brought back in-house.
From what you're saying, remunicipalization, again, the process of returning services back to public ownership and management after a period of private sector control, this does not seem to be inherently progressive. Is that right?
I'll preface that comment by making a slight amendment to my earlier definition of remunicipalization, and by removing the re at the start, because in fact there's many cases of bringing services into public control where they were never in public control in the first place. And I'll use another American example, the city of Missoula, Montana, where they municipalized the water supply in about 2018, I think. And it had always been privately owned and operated. So that was the very first time that Missoula had a publicly operated and owned water system. So in that case, we just referred to it as municipalization as opposed to re-municipalization. But dynamics are exactly the same. And I'll stick with the Missoula case in saying, are they necessarily inherently progressive? The answer is no. I mentioned earlier about fairly conservative municipalities, and it's not just in the US. You get the same thing happening even in Spain, where remunicipalization can be extremely politicized and very progressive in its orientation. But in many cases, it's a very pragmatic kind of development where bureaucrats are saying, hey, we can run these services more cheaply if we run them in-house, because we're not having to, as I said earlier, dealing with profits and contracts and expensive lawyers and monitoring private agencies, etc. So now, in some cases, once these bureaucrats start to look at what's going on beyond simply, the price of privatization, the fiscal cost of privatization, I've often had them tell me, I didn't really think that water was a political issue or electricity was a political issue, but now that I've looked at it, I realize, oh my gosh, this really is deeply political. And so, in cases like Missoula, and there's a bunch of cases in California where fairly mainstream pragmatic bureaucrats found themselves tasked with the responsibility of making a service public, and they just thought, well, this is just simply fiscal. Then they started to realize, okay, there's a lot more to it here. But that's a kind of in through the back door kind of thing. These more expansive forms of remunicipalization are cases where people really do want change. They want to tackle questions of commodification. They want to tackle questions of inequality. They want to tackle questions of climate change, etc. So one of the main points that I was making in my article was that there's nothing inherently good or bad about remunicipalization. What's required is having a very close qualitative and quantitative investigation of it to understand what are these dynamics? What is it that people are after? How radical or not are the demands that are being made? And, perhaps not surprisingly, it really cuts across a broad swath. And, at the extreme, you get very, very conservative, even authoritarian governments that are bringing services back into public hands because they want state control over these services. So in Hungary, for example, the Viktor Orban government has brought water services under public control, but for very authoritarian reasons. So, that's the opposite of being progressive. And, there's cases where, the goal is to be very, very progressive. So there's nothing inherently progressive or not progressive about the phenomenon.
And since we are, David, talking about basic services, basic needs, you mentioned water and electricity as examples, this can't help but be political, right? That these are things that people need. These are resources that are allocated in a sense, and where they go and how they are managed and who has access to them is of overriding importance.
The fact that they are essential services, and particularly water and sanitation services, one would hope would inherently make them political. But people that run these services are often engineers and bureaucrats who are sort of trained to think that these things are not political. And so, as I mentioned earlier, some of these more pragmatic forms of remunicipalization still somehow manage to discount the political nature. And, citizens may not even be aware of the fact that water has moved from private to public control. But I would say that by and large, once the debate starts, if it wasn't initiated at the grassroots level, once it starts, people start to pay more attention to it. And often bureaucrats and engineers and so on themselves start to realize, wow, yeah, this stuff really is political. We need to understand the depth and complexity of what's going on here and how they relate to the kind of social and cultural and economic dynamics around us. The question that I'm interested in is what kind of politics play out and win out, and whose voices are heard, and how radical or not are these opinions.
Let's talk about the history of these kinds of processes. So when European and North American cities industrialized in the 19th century, were the services that sprang up public or private?
I'm glad you brought that up because, in fact, with industrialization, most of these core services, water, electricity, natural gas, transportation, etc., were in fact privately run. And so from the mid 1800s through to the early 1900s, most towns and cities' basic services were run by private companies. We saw the first sort of wave of what I would call municipalizations, because they weren't re-municipalizing them, they were municipalizing them for the first time, starting in the late 1800s. London, England was one of the first places to do this. because it was just such a chaotic situation. There were 9 private water companies running the water supply for the City of London, and you were getting cholera outbreaks. You were having situations where the fire department wasn't able to access water services, etc. So a lot of very mainstream and even quite conservative politicians and theoreticians like John Stuart Mill started to push for bringing services into public hands because they were what academics refer to as natural monopolies. You're better having it operated by a single company rather than having 9 networks of underground pipes and overhead wires, etc. You're better off having it run by a single entity, and that there would be more control and accountability if they were publicly run. So we saw this massive wave of municipalization and nationalization from the late 1800s through to about the 1940s. By that time, there was a lot of services that were in public hands. There were, municipally run cinemas and restaurants and hotels, etc. So it wasn't really until the 1970s that we saw a kind of swing back to private ownership with the sort of neoliberal privatization wave. And what we're witnessing now, in some respects, is a kind of back to the future of what happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it's actually remarkable reading some of the writings from those times about why services should be publicly run instead of privately run 100 years ago. And the exact same arguments are being made today in this second re-municipalization wave. So yes, you're right to say that most services started off in private hands, went to public hands, went back to private hands, and now we're seeing a kind of reversal once again back to public ownership.
Did socialists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, did they see municipalization as effecting fundamental change, fundamental social and economic change?
It depends on what brand of socialism. And again, not much different today with a wide variety of how people interpret socialism. So we did see a rapid growth in what was called at the time municipal socialisms. Places like Vienna in Austria, where there was a big push to bring services under public control, housing, and a wide range of services. But throughout the United States as well, there were governments running on a municipal socialism ticket. And they would call out what they called the robber barons of the day, who were controlling water and electricity and so on. And they were using, explicitly quote unquote socialist language to push for the municipalization and nationalization of essential services. And again, we saw that throughout Europe and North America. Not so much in Africa and Asia because of the colonial period, but parts of Latin America, we saw this happening, as well in the 1930s and earlier. But there were more radical socialists who saw it as a kind of divergence, and I make reference in the article to a quote by Lenin at the time, who said, this just distracts us from the real task at hand, which is a kind of international socialism and a scaling up to public ownership and management at the national level. And we need a much more radical agenda. And he sort of, called the municipal socialists Fabians for distracting us, and, basically saying that they're a bunch of social democrats who aren't radical enough. But, that's I think an overstatement. There was actually some very interesting and quite radical and quite nuanced attempts by municipalities, particularly in Europe, under the banner of municipal socialism, where there were attempts to be quite radical in the redistribution of resources that could be attained through basic services and affordability, and giving access to housing and access to food and transportation, etc. So, the same debate I think exists today is, can you have radical change in a single city with a single service. Is that socialism? And maybe that's a question we can get at in this interview today.
Well, what do you think of that question? How would you answer it?
At one level, it's hard not to agree with Lenin that if we are going to have deep-seated, radical, fundamental change at the global level, we need to change the underlying parameters and dynamics and power structures of a market economy. And you are simply not going to do that by making water services public in a single city. Having said that, you can do some very, very progressive things by having services brought back into public control. With water and electricity and education and transport, these are often life and death kinds of services, giving people access to education and life-saving medications and, preventing diarrhea. So yes, you can do radical things, and you can use these services to mobilize and politicize, and to push for remunicipalization in other areas. So if a city makes its water public again and says, wow, this is a lot better than how it used to be when it was privately run, maybe you can then start to mobilize around public transportation and public housing and public banking and so on. So I don't think there's an easy or singular answer to it. It's certainly not a magic bullet. You have to, if you're going to have a kind of radical movement, municipalization itself has to have a radical content to it. And I think it has to then ask questions about, broader services and how it then connects up to broader structures of accumulation and consumption. And ultimately, what kinds of labor and so on is going into producing these services. So I think it has a huge potential to be quite radical, but it's a stepping stone. It's not an end in itself to a more radical future.
So you identify in this article in Socialist Register 3 types of remunicipalizations. One is autocratic state capitalist, I believe. The second is market managerialism. And the third is social democratic. Could you describe each of these types?
Yeah, I'll describe the first 2 fairly quickly because I've made reference to them. The kind of autocratic forms of remunicipalization are by quite authoritarian governments, typically at a national level, where they seek state control over these important levers of social and political and economic power, and they want them to be, run by people that are friendly to their governments, and they can often use them to, quite literally turn off the taps to people that aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, etc. So, that kind of remunicipalization is obviously deeply problematic. The second kind, the kind of market managerialism, refers to that more pragmatic form of remunicipalization where typically bureaucrats have determined that privatization didn't work. It's not saving money, and it's making life more difficult for them by the complexities of managing contracts and hiring expensive lawyers, etc. And they've just determined that they can do it equally well in-house and at a cheaper price. But they tend to sort of depoliticize these services, and it doesn't often lead to much kind of change on the ground.
Yeah, and just to say that you read it that some of the typical causes of the failure of a privatization project include rising prices, growing inequality, worsening service quality, lack of investment in infrastructure, lack of transparency in decision-making, high costs of regulation, increasing levels of corruption, and exorbitant profit-taking. So those are some of the possible causes of a privatization project's failure. And I think you were going to move into the third kind of remunicipalization, right?
Yes, so that third type of remunicipalization I refer to as a social democratic one, and it's fairly broad in its scope. It's a sort of mild and more radical versions of it. But it's social democratic insofar as it wants to address the kinds of inequities and problems with climate change, et cetera. And so often, affordability is a big issue for people, and ensuring that low-income households can afford their electricity bills. That kind of equity question is a global one, and private companies have typically made these services much more expensive, and often the way that they price things, will favor industry and wealthier households at the expense of low-income households. So, often what these social democratic reforms are trying to do is address questions of affordability, but they also take on the more political dimensions around democratic decision-making processes, trying to push for participatory forums so that citizens can have their voices heard around not just decision making but long-term planning. They often also want to talk about long-term environmental impacts and global warming and climate change, and transitioning, for example, to renewable energies as opposed to just business as usual to try and keep the cost of electricity down. They might be fighting for affordability while at the same time saying we should be investing in solar panels and windmills, etc. So it tends to be much more multidimensional than that more pragmatic kinds of municipalization that I referred to earlier. But it's social democratic. And, I do also talk about two other much more radical forms of remunicipalization, a kind of anti-capitalist perspective and an even anti-state perspective. And these tend to be much more marginal voices in the movement. And in fact, we haven't really seen these kinds of remunicipalizations in practice. But there are many people who, like Lenin 100 years ago, criticize remunicipalizations for not going far enough, for not tackling underlying questions of commodification and so on. And although you get these voices that they're active in the remunicipalization movements, in the end, when services are brought back in-house, they tend to be much more moderate. They're not using anti-capitalist language, etc. They're sort of playing at the margins of inequality and democratic governance, but not the kind of radical reforms that some people think need to happen with these essential services.
So if the third type of remunicipalization you referred to, the social democratic one, if it does not constitute, in your opinion, a sufficient challenge to commodification and market logics, then what would a radical remunicipalization look like?
So I think two things need to be thought about here. One is the nature of the remunicipalization itself and the extent to which it takes questions of equity and social justice and environmental justice seriously, how dramatic the changes are to the way that people access their services, how they pay for them, etc. And so you can have much more radical versions of a social democratic form of remunicipalization in some places than in others. So you can, I think, operationalize it in a way that people start to think differently about what their electricity means. And it's not just, a commodity, but it's something that represents, massive environmental implications. And people start to become aware of, the type of electricity services that they have, or, how housing is operated, or who's collecting their garbage, and, gender differentials and racialization issues that go on within these public services. So, you can have much more radical politicized forms of remunicipalization. But at the second level, it has to go beyond a single service and beyond a single city. And we have to start talking about questions of, okay, so let's say, Paris has remunicipalized its water supply, which it did in 2010. What is Paris now doing to make sure that water is public and affordable and sustainable in other parts of the world? And I use that example in part because the city of Paris does have outreach programs where they work in various parts of West Africa, in particular North Africa, trying to promote remunicipalization and build solidarity with other municipalities. But these tend to be quite small components of what's going on, and not a lot of people are aware of these things. So it does get back to that central question that Lenin raised, which is, can you have socialism in a single place, let alone a single city or a single sector? And so, you have to make sure that the service that you're remunicipalizing, that there's radical conversations about what it means and transforming its meaning, and linking those up to broader transformations across place and location, and indeed across services. And, these things tend to be quite siloized. So debates about remunicipalization in the water sector aren't often engaged with actions on remunicipalization in electricity or in healthcare or in transportation. So we need a much more holistic and global, national at the very least, kind of take on these things. And why does, making a service public in one city, how does that link up with what's going on at a much broader scale? That's the kind of more transformative potential that I'm referring to in the article.
Well, what you're suggesting, David, is that an initiative along the lines, a radical initiative along the lines that you're proposing, would require collaboration, would require coalition. So we're talking not just about people within the state or maybe specific advocates of a remunicipalization project, but involving a variety of actors from a variety of sectors of society. Fair to say?
Yes, that is exactly what's needed. And the most successful remunicipalizations have been ones that have involved labor unions, grassroots, community organizations, NGOs, progressive bureaucrats, and politicians, because they're able to bring different strengths and perspectives and insights. And it also means that you've got a kind of top to bottom kind of commitment to change. That's not to say that they're always in agreement. There's as many different opinions as to what a post-private service should look like. But generally speaking, these broad-based coalitions have been much more effective at making remunicipalization happen, and B, having more transformative forms of remunicipalization once it's back in public control.
Now, in your article, you acknowledge that there are cases where working with and within the state is not possible, either because the state is too autocratic or simply non-existent. I'm reading now from your article. In these instances, community-led services can and have proven to be an effective substitute for privatization. However, idealized notions of autonomous forms of public services in which all forms of state are rejected in favor of non-hierarchical self-organization can be deeply problematic. How so?
I'll just reinforce the point that you're making there about the fact that communities can and have run services. in some respects, the kinds of services we're talking about are relatively recent. Industrialized forms of water and electricity and transportation and housing, etc. So, people ran these services themselves for centuries, most of human history. There were artisanal forms of water management and energy and housing and education, etc. And in many parts of the world, as you mentioned, there's governments just are not providing these services, and particularly indigenous communities in Latin America continue to run and operate water services in ways that they've done for centuries. And so they often are very reluctant and very uncomfortable even with the idea of remunicipalization. I remember going to Cochabamba in Bolivia, where they had, there'd been the water wars of 2000, trying to get control of water after it had been privatized. And having conversations with people about this, and a lot of people said, we don't want state control. We want community control. We don't trust the state. We don't believe that the state will operate in our interests. And we, particularly indigenous communities, we've been doing this ourselves for centuries. And so let us get on with it. And I have a lot of respect for those things, and I think we have to understand them and admire them and promote them where we can. My comment is more about communities where the state has just simply ignored them because they're on the margins of society. And often, there's this call for, either a commons or some kind of community control, which in practice can really kind of boil down to just a kind of self-help project where people end up doing their own labor, often in dangerous kinds of conditions, dealing with sewage and sludge and electricity and so on, without the proper training and equipment, or in informal settlements, where 1 in 3 people in the global south living in cities are living in shacks, in informal communities, and the state is not providing these kinds of services for them. So my point is that we can't rely on some kind of mythical community action to provide services on the scale and at the urgency that's required. The state just has to be involved. The state has the capacity, it has the resources, it can bring skills, etc. But that's not to say that the state should literally or figuratively steamroll these services through communities. It has to be done in collaboration with, in terms of the design and planning and ongoing operation and decision making. Can't simply be done in a top-down way. And gets back to my earlier point about the more broad-based these initiatives are in terms of communities and labor organizations and bureaucrats and politicians and NGOs, etc. The more effective they tend to be, because you're bringing a broad set of resources to the table. So the reality is that some communities can and should continue to run their services. My point is more there is this kind of romanticization of community-led services, which I think ignores the fact that many communities don't have the resources. They're too fragile, they're too transient, and they're just too desperately poor to put the kinds of infrastructure in place that's required to deal with cholera and tuberculosis and diarrhea, etc. And so there's a real urgency that only the state can bring in terms of resources and equipment and knowledge, etc., often to these kinds of cases.
Well, you've referred a couple times to the re-municipalization of Paris's water services in 2010. Now, this was a type of re-municipalization that you call social democratic, so it's limited politically in your view. But I do think it would be useful to hear about the concrete steps involved in such a project. So what exactly happened? What did Paris do to its water services that constitutes re-municipalization?
The case of Paris is an interesting one because it started off in a very pragmatic way and has only really become more progressive since it was re-municipalized. But to just answer your first question, the water has been back and forth in public and private control in Paris for a century and a half. Most recently, prior to 2010, water services were run by the two big multinational giants, Veolia and Suez, which are now actually a single company, not in France, but elsewhere. And so when those 25-year contracts came to an end, the municipal government simply said, we're not going to renew these contracts. We're going to make it public again. Now, it was the socialist government, and socialist as in that's the name of the party. They're not a particularly radical political party. But they saw it as an opportunity to, I think, differentiate themselves, and decided at a very senior level that they were just not going to renew the contract with Veolia and Suez. And so on January 1st, 2010, it moved from being privately run to being publicly run. And most Parisians didn't even know it had happened, which is partly a sign of success. Nothing collapsed. Everything continued on as normal. But there wasn't, a huge amount of public conversation about it. Since then, there have been quite a few more progressive things happening. They've introduced what they call a water observatory, where citizens are able to participate in decision making. They've introduced much more progressive tariff structures around pricing and affordability. They've done some international outreach and solidarity initiatives with other public water operator providers around the world. They are doing more sustainable kind of environmental planning around upstream and downstream water management. And in fact, Eau de Paris, which is the name of the public company, was spearheading the initiative to try and make the river, the Seine, swimmable for last year's Olympics in Paris. In the end, it wasn't possible, but now, as of this summer, people are now swimming again in the Seine after 100 and whatever years of it being far too polluted. So people have started to realize, hey, wow, this public water company actually is different. It's they're doing things that are not just about profit taking. They're seeing this as a public good and trying to address public equity and long-term environmental sustainability, etc. So I think what it goes to show is that you don't necessarily have to start off with radical initiatives. Those things can come after the fact. And Paris has done, I think, a pretty good job at that. Now, is it radical as in, being anti-capitalist? No, far from it. But it has introduced a lot of very progressive, social democratic kinds of principles.
I'm going to read another passage from your article. An unfortunate outcome of the privatization debate has been the creation of a simplistic binary. Private is bad, public is good. As we have seen with the realities of re-municipalization, public can come in many shapes and sizes, some of which are deeply problematic. Elaborate on that statement.
Yeah, it gets back to that point that there is no single form of re-municipalization. Everything from the kind of autocratic initiatives in places like Hungary to much more progressive social democratic initiatives like in the city of Paris. And then, very pragmatic kinds of initiatives in the United States where water and other services have been brought back in-house simply because it's cheaper to do so. So, the point I'm making there really is that there tends to be this kind of thought that re-municipalization is an inherently good thing because it's bringing services back into public control. But my point is, well, what kind of public control? Who's in control? What are the objectives of the service? Who's making decisions? How affordable are services? Are they, addressing long-term environmental and social justice questions? Unfortunately, we have these two simple words, public and private. And in fact, there's, many, many ways that a public service can be run. The Nazis ran all kinds of very effective public services, but of course, they were deeply problematic in many other ways. So Does that mean because it's public, it's good? No. We want public services that are transparent and accountable and affordable and environmentally sustainable, etc. And, nobody is going to excel on all of these fronts. There's no, pure or perfect form of public service. The challenge is to try and do as well as you can on as many of these kinds of criteria as possible. And there's always space for improvement, and there's always space for change. And unfortunately, the public-private debate has tended to create these simplistic binaries of, just because something is in public control, therefore it's good. I'm sure every one of your listeners would give about 5 seconds of thought to thinking of a bad public service that they've encountered in their lives. There's lots of bad public services out there. So, whether it's currently public or we're making it public, we should be constantly thinking about what is it that we want from our public services. What kinds of, institutional structure, organizational structure, ideological structure, financial structure do we want, and how are we going to make that work for us in ways that are progressive?
So at one point in your article in Socialist Register 2025, you referred to the most effective tool we have for addressing the social, economic, and ecological crises associated with unequal public services. Are you arguing that radical re-municipalization is that tool?
I don't actually recall the exact context of that sentence. I'm not sure that re-municipalization is so much a tool as it is a process. And so I guess my answer to that would be, as a process, yes, it's a very important and I would argue necessary first step, because we know that privatization has basically failed on every front imaginable, and every service imaginable and around the world. So we have to change the kind of privatization that happened in the past and continues to happen today. And making these services public once again, or for the first time, is a process that has to happen. The tools then come down to, questions of, well, how are you going to price these services? Who is going to be making decisions about these services? How are you going to make public service providers accountable and transparent? And I think re-municipalization offers a platform for rethinking the way that we provide services. And what we don't want to do is go back to the kind of old way of providing services, which was a very top-down, often deeply racist and racialized and gendered way of providing public services. We need to rethink and remake public services in a new way that is not private and not the kind of old school public, but something that's much more innovative and progressive and sustainable in the long run.
David McDonald, Professor of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, Director and founder of the Municipal Services Project. David, thanks very much for your work and for joining us today.
Thank you, CS.
And this is CS, suggesting the important thing is not to stop questioning, as Albert Einstein once said, and we hope you'll join us next time.